Let us pray. O God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love. And work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth. That in your good time, all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
That is the collect for the human family. That is in your Book of Common Prayer. So, I am so excited to have with us today Dr. Alton Wallace. He serves as the church historian at Alfred Street Baptist Church right down the way, but he is a mathematician by profession. And he developed an interest in history while reading the book Roots in 1976. And since then he has written several history books on local and national history. One of them that includes tracing the history of his family of tobacco farmers in North Carolina. He also has an award-winning book entitled Once I Was Young?
I once was
Young. Oh yeah, you got an extra I in there for me. That kind of messed me up.
Okay.
That's a line from the hymn, right? Amazing Grace.
Right.
And it documents the history of Alfred Street Baptist. So we're going to hear a little bit about that this morning. Dr. Wallace's professional life, he has spent a lot of time working in the defense world, and he is currently working for the Institute for Defense Analyses, a nonprofit DoD think tank that also conducts studies and analyses on defense issues. He is a big advocate for education and is involved in many causes that support young students getting educations. And so, with no further ado, we are absolutely delighted. Al, if you will please come up, and will you welcome him warmly?
Hello, boys and girls. In a prior life, I was a college professor, and I always greeted my class, good morning, boys and girls. As she said, my name is Alton Wallace. I am from New Bern, North Carolina. New Bern was the colonial capital of North Carolina before it moved to Raleigh. It's founded in 1710, so it's older than Old Town even. A little historical town. Again, I was not born in the city. I'm a country boy, was brought up on a tobacco farm outside of New Bern that I still own. Most of you have never seen a black farmer, right? There are very few left. And anyway, I come from that profession. My father was also a Baptist minister. And what that means is I've never sinned. Many of you have read about a man who was without sin, but few of you have ever seen one in the flesh. And as the son of a preacher man, I never sinned. But I understand it is a lot of fun. Right? And so later in life, that's on my list of things to do. I'm going to give you a brief history of the Alfred Street Baptist Church. That's right down the street. And what is interesting is there are things happening down there that you probably have no idea about because of the way history gets dissipated. Next slide. Everything I'm going to tell you is in this book she mentioned, I Once Was Young. The title is taken from the 37th Psalm. I once was young, but now I'm old. But I have never seen the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging bread. I once was young. That was the title of our book. It was published as part of our bicentennial in 2003. Again, we're 200 years old, 1803 to 2003. So the book was published in 2003. It won the Alexandria Historical Society's History Award in 2004. As you're aware, here in Old Town, we're serious about our history, right? And every year, the Alexandria Historical Society picks an event, an activity, an excavation, or whatever, and makes an award for the best effort for that year. And in the year 2004, this book was awarded the Historical Society as the most significant contribution to the preservation of history here in Old Town. I'll tell you why later. There are copies of it in the libraries here at Queen Street. All the Alexandria libraries have copies here. It's at the State Library in Richmond. It's at the Library of Congress on Capitol Hill. There are copies of it in New York and a lot of the some of the other universities. I'll tell you now why it accepted that award. The history of Old Town is very white-centric. You can have a guest come in for the weekend, take them out to dinner, tour Old Town, and walk away not knowing there are any black people here or that black people here made any contributions. And so when I wrote this book, that was the first time that a lot of this history was published. And what happened is the book is about the history of this church. However, for much of our history here in Old Town, if something happened on the black side of town of significance, it happened in Alfred Street Baptist Church. So the history of this church is the black history of Old Town, and it was for that reason that the Historical Society awarded this book the History Award in 2004. If you read it, it's the church history, pictures of the windows, who the preachers were, who the mothers, Women's Day chairperson, who led the youth department, all that little stuff that you do about in church histories. And so if you read it, you'll get all those facts and figures, what the offering was, all that kind of stuff, who died, who had significant funerals. But after you finish all 250 pages of it, you should walk away with those three impressions. When you finish reading the book, you should say, my God, that is a stable church. Stable. We've been here 214 years. You're a little older, but the fact that we even exist at this point, a church that came out of slavery, that's a powerful testimony. Think about all the things you know that are gone. How many of you used to fly Pan Am Airways? You remember Pan Am? They're gone. You remember the Hat Company? They are gone. You remember Errol's Video? They are gone. All these great companies with titans in industry leading them, they're gone. We are surviving. We're still here. That's a powerful testament to our stability. You're also here, but there's one thing we've done that you've not done, and that's this second point on pastors. In an Episcopal church, every now and then, every 8 years, 7 years, the bishop or whoever sends you a new pastor, or you get, there's some rotation. But in the Baptist tradition, we elect our pastors, and as long as pastor and people are on one accord, you continue just as in a marriage, right? So our current pastor's been there 10 years. Woo, 10 years? Oh, that's great.
Al, just to correct you, we do the same.
You do the same?
Yeah.
Okay. But we elect, and as long as pastor and people together, you continue. So our current pastor, 10 years, right? The guy preceding him was here 42 years. One guy, 42 years? John Peterson, he was on the school board here. 42 years, oh my God. The guy that preceded him was here for 43 years. So 2 pastors in 85 years, from 43 and then followed by one who's 42. 85 years, 2 pastors. That is the definition of stability. If you continue reading the book, another impression you'll get is, my God, these guys are progressive. And there are a lot of ways we can illustrate our progressive nature, but one is our treatment of women. Interestingly, among all the nation's institutions, the church is one of the most repressive when it comes to treatment of women. Say amen. Amen. Exactly. And yeah, that's right. In the Baptist tradition, we have something called call and response. So when I say amen, say amen. Okay. But one of the ways that illustrates our progressive nature is our treatment of women. In your denomination, I think you start ordaining women in 76. Okay, here's a homework question. When did Christ Church ordain its first woman? Don't answer now. That's homework. That's homework.
You know the answer.
He knows the answer. What was it?
We called Martha Horn in 1985.
85, right, okay. And what happened is Alfred Street ordained women in 1980. Right down the street, we began ordaining women in 1980. And when it happened, it was more controversial even than ordaining gays is today. When we ordained a woman, we were thrown out of all the all our conventions and all that, right? It was on the news. Black church in Old Town ordains woman, expelled from conventions, details at 11. There's a picture in here, but it was very controversial at the time. So we began ordaining women in 1980, and over time, just as you have, we promoted women in all of our leadership positions. And we won a few churches, particularly Black Baptist churches, to have a woman serve as our pastor prior to the one now. particularly of a church of our size. We're like 7,000 people now. To have a woman, a major church like that, it's unusual. And about 35% of our current leadership is women. In the Baptist church, perhaps different from yours, the number one person there is the pastor, comma. Then the number two person is not another minister, it's the chair of deacons. In the Baptist church, something happens to the pastor, the chair of deacon takes over. And in our case, the chair of deacons is a beautiful lady, nice hair, sweet lips. Oh God, he didn't say that, did he? I say that because it is my lovely wife of 48 years. So the number two person at our church is my lovely wife. But so we're a progressive church. And again, we're also very socially conscious. Missions, because of our involvement in social efforts, chances are we get more visits from your governor and governor-elects than you do. I mean, they are there all the time. And part of that is, like I said, on a typical Sunday, we have 4 services, but on a typical Sunday, we'll have, 3,000 people worship. But we also have online streaming, and we have like 10,000 people who watch. So if you're a politician and want to get your face out, not only in America, but in Australia, Europe, whatever, you come to Alpha Street, you're in front of 1,000 people, but your image goes around the world. We're involved in missions and all that, but we're very socially conscious. One of the things, and this is a homework assignment, over the Christmas holidays, I want you to come by Alpha Street twice. I want you to walk by one day, and I want you to drive by at night. The Christmas lights are up now. But we're very conscious about the environment. And so if you come, the grounds are always perfect. When it's time to put out petunias, we put out petunias. When it's time for the wax begonias out. What's the one? Anyway, the grounds are always perfectly kept and manicured because of our socially consciousness about environmental issues. Next slide. That's what you find out about Alfred Street if you read the book, but nobody reads books anymore, right? Where do you get your information? Off the web, right? And so if you Google the web, these are the kinds of things you're going to see. For Easter 2016, President Obama and his wife, you recall, worshiped at Alfred Street. It tied up Old Town because of the traffic. It was a big hassle. And it was a hassle to the people outside, next slide, but it was also a hassle to the people inside. Because coming in service that morning, the Secret Service is there, so we had to go through screening just like you do at the airport. And there was no pre-check. Everybody had to open their pocketbook. This picture here, he's coming in the sanctuary. This is my lovely wife with the black and white blouse on. Because she is an important person, she gets to sit on the front row. I am her driver, but that day she let me sit on the front row with her. Now, that was a major effort, and it was a major hassle to have the president worshiping at Alton Street. But we survived it, and we did well at it. Next slide. You know why? Because he did it the year before. Think about that. For 2 successive Easters, the most powerful man on the planet worshiped at our church on the high holy day of the Christian calendar, right? For 2 successive years. That's a powerful statement. But that's what you'll find if you Google Alfred Street Baptist Church on the web. Next slide. If you continue Googling, you'll find things like this. Alfred Street Baptist Church donates $1 million to the Smithsonian for the development of the African American Museum there. Churches don't give $1 million to museums, right? Yeah. Right, okay. But Alfred Street Baptist Church gave $1 million. And again, this is part of that socially conscious effort, right? But that's what the kind of thing that happens right down the street here. Next slide. But that was not always the case. That was not always the case. That's what we're going to do now. We're going to go back to the beginning and find out, how did you guys get started and happen to be where you are in Old Town? So this is a map in Old Town in 1803, right? Okay, so you guys are here. We are here. And at that time, the town was only about 7,000 to 8,000 people, right? The port down here by Chart House, that we were shipping here, tobacco and that kind of thing. The other thing that's interesting when I saw this map was this arrow, the Beltway. That was all water. That area was all filled in. And later we show another map, but the Great Hunting Creek ran there. And so like when George Washington was coming up from Mount Vernon, he had to go north up like the Telegraph Road to cross over to come into Old Town. But this is Old Town in 1803. Next slide. And again, at our beginning, you guys are a little older than us, but so beginning in 1803, we missed George Washington and we missed John Adams. But from Thomas Jefferson all the way through, we've been here for all the presidents. And so, at some sense, we're almost as old as the United States of America. You are, but we've seen it all too, right here in Old Town. Next slide. So how'd you guys get started? How did Baptists end up in Old Town? You all know with the Baptist denomination, we came out of Europe. Roger Williams brought us to Providence, Rhode Island. Okay, and then from Providence, the Baptist denomination trickled south. By 1803, there was a single Baptist church in all of Northern Virginia. It was out here on 236, near Northern Virginia Community College, a single Baptist church there. And so if you wanted to be Baptist, that's where you went to church, right? And so from here out there, it's a long way in a Jeep Grand Cherokee, that's what I have, but it's a long way in a horse and buggy, right? And so in June of that year, some of the people from Old Town who worshiped out there, about 12 or 14 of them, they requested a dismission, permission to leave there and form their own church. And permission was granted, and so they formed the Alexandria Baptist Society that began worshiping here in the basement of the courthouse. It was a storefront, what you would call a storefront church, in the basement of the courthouse. And over time, that congregation grew. They baptized their first black person June of that year, and we trace her as our first member. A lady named Black Susan was baptized. We were initially in the courthouse, then we moved where Downtown Baptist is now. That next year they bought a lot there and we moved there. And again, it was a conjoined congregation. That was a term that was used, conjoined between us and the people at First Baptist. So it was a black church and a white church conjoined, but during slavery there were prohibitions on what the black people could do. So we couldn't sing in the choir, we couldn't usher, we couldn't preach. We sat in the balcony, right? In time, the black people said, we'd like to do our own thing. We like your music, God bless you, but we want to do our own music. And so the arrangement was, okay, guys, you still got to come here on Sunday and be one of us, because those are the rules, but we'll let you meet on the side on Wednesdays and Fridays. And so we formed something called the Colored Baptist Society. And it was free and slave. And we would save our little nickels and dimes with our own little treasury. And in due season, we moved to where we are now. Next slide. And this is a timeline. So in 1803, we were formed here in Old Town, right? About 1818, after still part of this conjoined body because slavery required that, we moved to where we are now on Alpha Street. But when we initially moved there, we were still we were renting the property there. In time, we saved our nickels and dimes and actually purchased that site in 1842. And then in 1855, we built what we call the old church, which is still there now. And that's what you see on the extreme right, the 1855 church that was built in by slave labor, because slavery is still going on at that time, right? And then we all know what happens in 1861. The Civil War breaks out, and our church was captured and used as a hospital in the Civil War. I'm a veteran, and like when we take over a country like we invade in Iraq, first thing we go in and ran Saddam Hussein outright, took all his palaces and the church's right to use as headquarters. And so the same thing happened here. When the Yankees came across the river and captured Old Town, they took our church among other properties and began using it as a hospital. Next slide. Speaking of the Civil War, let's talk a little about our church's involvement in the Civil War. In the Civil War, as I indicated, our church was captured and used as a Union hospital. Then in 1863, after President Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation, black soldiers could be recruited now. And so there were over 200,000 black soldiers that recruited, not all here in Old Town, but throughout the nation. But our church at that point began being used as a recruiting station for colored troops. Our pastor then, Reverend Samuel Madden, was one of about 100 black officers in the entire Union Army. And what was, I mean, so the fact that you're one of 100 out of 200,000 soldiers, the fact that you're an officer, that's a powerful statement in and of itself. But what is even more powerful is how he got his commission. I'm an ROTC cadet, and I'll tell you later about it. But the way he got his commission was he wrote a letter to then President Abraham Lincoln, saying, "Dear President Lincoln, I'm a black pastor in Old Town, and I strongly support the Union cause, and I'd like to be an officer in the Union Army. Can you hook me up?" Right? So he sends this letter to President Lincoln, and President Lincoln sends him, the White House sends a letter back saying, "Dear Reverend Madden, we're in receipt of your letter requesting permission to be a Union officer. Yes, consider yourself hooked up." And it was in that manner that he became an officer, a direct commission from the President of the United States. That was a bad brother. How many of you, this is still doing slavery, right? To write the President of the United States and get a direct commission from him into the Union Army. How many of you have even written the President? I don't mean an email. How many of you even know how to do cursive writing? How many of you have written a cursive writing letter to the President requesting anything? Few of us do. But he had the audacity to do that. And in so doing, he received the commission from the President. That speaks to the kind of guy that he was. During the war, I tell you, this was our church here, but people don't realize it's in the middle of the block on the corner of Alfred and Duke, where where our sanctuary now sits, was a railhead. And at that time, President Lincoln was having a new Air Force One built, if you will, okay? Except they used trains. And he had this coach built for him, but he never got to use it because he was assassinated before he ever got to use it. But it was used to take his body back to Springfield on that long circuitous trek. But the coach was built right where our sanctuary sits now. One of our deacons, Deacon George Seaton, he lived over by where the Safeway, and we're going to talk about him in a moment. Following the war, at the end of the war, he was elected to the legislature in Richmond and was part of a grand jury that indicted Jeff Davis. And as you know, he was not tried later. But I thought there was an element of poetic justice or something in that. And one of the other things about Alexandria during that time is it was during the Civil War that Alexandria became a black town, and I'll show you that in a moment. And that that reinforces the comment I was making up first about this book. Most of you probably are not aware that Alexandria used to be a black city, and most of what went on here was in the black community. But over time, that's been all gone away. And so if you walk around now, you could walk around the whole area and not know there was ever any black people here. Next slide. And so let's talk about Old Town and its black history. Okay, this is what happened. During the Civil War, Alexandria voted to succeed, and then we know the Unions came across the river and captured it the next day or whatever. Then all the white citizens who were Confederates fled south to Richmond behind Confederate lines, right? So Alexandria was left with the Union soldiers, the blacks, and a couple of whites here, right? As the war progressed, as freed blacks left the South headed north, guess what the first free city they got to was? Alexandria, Virginia. And so they settled here in mass. And so the population, I said before the war, was like 7,000, 8,000. It blew up to 10,000, 12,000, primarily with black people that moved here. And when they got here, they settled and did all the things black people do. They have churches, they had all kind of places. And what you see in these blocks are the various black neighborhoods that were here. And so what happened, aside from the King Street central hub, just about all the way around were black neighborhoods. And so you're here. And so from here on Columbus, these are some of my colleagues from Alfred Street. If you wonder, who are these black people coming in? These are my colleagues from Alfred Street. But what happened is, so Christ Church is here. If you leave here going up Columbus Street, all the way up to where the Recreation Center, all that was black. And there are remnants of that still left in the area today. For example, if you leave here and go up to Queen Street, if you turn right, there's the Queen Street Library. Yeah. But if you turn left, in that first block, most of the houses are, your 10, 12-foot townhouses. Then you get to the house with a big wraparound porch on it. So I wonder what that house is here. That house is the Alfred Street Baptist Church parsonage. Really? Yeah. The Alfred Street Baptist Church parsonage is right around the corner here on Queen Street. Why would Alfred Street build their parsonage here in the white part of Old Town? Because this area used to be the black part of Old Town. That's why. It was our area. Our pastor no longer lives there, but we still own the house and we rent it out. But the next time you go up to Queen Street, turn left and go down, and there's this house with this beautiful wraparound porch. I didn't know Alfred Street owned that house. Yes, that's our parsonage. And throughout the city, as you go around the neighborhoods, you'll see that same kind of thing. For example, the yellow part where Alfred Street is now, it was interesting this past Sunday, last week, my sister was here from Norfolk for Thanksgiving, right? And so we had brunch down on the waterfront by the boat club or whatever. And then afterward, I gave her a little quick tour of Old Town. We came up King Street, drove by here, and on the way down to Alfred Street to pick up our car, she said, Alton, how did your church get here in Old Town? That's what she asked. How did your church get here in Old Town? What she meant was, how did your black church get here in the white part of Old Town? And I said, no, baby, you're asking the wrong question. We've been here since 1803. It ain't how we got here. How did we get here? No, how did they get here? Okay. We've been here. And so that whole area, we start buying that area in 1806 because it was low-lying and marshy, called the bottom. Nobody wanted to use it. And that's how we were able to buy it. But we've been there. And then about 1970, that's when that area began to flip. And so now it's all white, but that area was all black. There are some interesting things that happen over here. By everybody knows where the Old Town Safeway is, right? Yeah. If you go to the Safeway, you get you some wine, you get some cheese, come out of the car, you're in the parking lot, and you look across the street from the parking lot, you see a rather low building with a green awning on it. So I don't know what that is over there, right? And you look, and there are all these black people coming out. So, oh my God, what's all these black people doing over here, right? Those black people over there, because that used to be their neighborhood, and that's why they built their community center and their clubhouse right there in their neighborhood. There was a time where if you were black in Old Town, if you were black here and was of stature, you belonged to that club. It's called the Progressive Club. It's still there. But they built it there because that was the center of their neighborhood. And so it didn't, well, you get the question, right? Okay. If you leave the Safeway and go up to the, go up the hill to Lee Street and from the Safeway, go up and take a right on Lee. Again, you're going along, you see this little church, a little small church. And you look and, oh my God, here's some black people coming out of this church. How did they get here? And you go up to the church and look and say, my God, the cornerstone says 1863. They built that church there in 1863 as the slaves were migrating here and when that area was all black. Incidentally, we're Baptists, and what we do is water submersion, right? I mean, you got to be baptized. So now we have indoor pools, but in the old days, we didn't have indoor pools, so we baptized in the river. And that's where we baptized, was right along here. And the reason was because our members lived in that area, and after you baptized, you could come into the homes to change your clothes before we walk back over to church, right? So all that area down here was also black. So from about 1865, during the Civil War, until about 1975, 80, the major parts of Old Town were black. And then we had the big flip. And most people, like I say, you can bring a guest here, walk them around, they have no idea black people ever used to live here. Parenthetically, the same is true of Georgetown. Georgetown was a black town, right? And the same thing happens, those of you who jog, how many of you still jog? Okay, he does. Okay, God bless, you're former military. Exactly. We run. I'm military too. But you can be jogging through the back streets of Georgetown, and the same thing, you're running. It's like, oh my God, what's that? There's some black people coming out of this church in here. What are they doing in here? They are in there because they built that church there in 1870 when Old Town was a black town. Okay, next slide. The rest of our history following the Civil War is pretty close to, as I indicate here, we did the same things you did. We bought windows, we had pews and that kind of thing. And ultimately, we constructed those two buildings you see at the bottom. 1855, we had the 1855 church that I told you. Then in 1980, we moved into a new church. And then in 1994, we expanded it to what you see now. And that's the homework. I want you to drive by at night to see the lights, and I want you to walk by one day to actually see the architecture, to see what happens when you take 3 buildings and built over 150 years and integrate them. Next slide. And again, because of the history I just told you about, like you, we have the same plaques that you have. We're on the National Register of Historic Places. and we're on the Virginia Association because of our involvement in history of this city. Next slide. The story I just told you about that church parallels the life of this little boy. The church came out of slavery and went on to contribute $1 million to the museum and became a worship place for presidents. This little boy came out of segregation in the rural South and underwent all the nonsense you've seen on television. He was born shortly after World War II in eastern North Carolina, in the rural areas. And everything you've seen about segregation and all that nonsense, this little boy went through. So he was born during a period when the South was segregated. So he went to segregated schools. He remembers drinking out of the segregated water fountains. He did all that nonsense you see on TV. But as a kid, he didn't know it wasn't, he didn't know that wasn't, you know, he thought that's the way things were supposed to be. And it was finally about 10 or 11 years old before he realized that being black in America was different. He knew he was black, but he didn't know that mattered until he was about 10, 11 years old. A couple of weeks ago, you had another guest here. He was a jazz musician. He was talking about the same thing happened to him. He'd been all over the world. And as an 11-year-old Boy Scout, he was leading a parade outside of Boston, and people started throwing rocks at him. He's like, what are they throwing these rocks at me? He hadn't realized that he was black and that being black was different. Well, the same happened with this little boy. He was about 11 years old before he realized that being black was different. I won't go through the details of how that happened, but following that, that's when he began sensitized to race and hatred and bigotry. And it came in various forms over time. It came in his education, particularly in education. Throughout our nation's history, there's always been a big effort to minimize the education that African Americans get, right? So during slavery, it was against the law to teach black kids to read, right? And then over time, there were various things done to minimize education opportunities for black kids, myself included. And so even though the Supreme Court decision on integration happened in '54, all my early childhood continued in black schools, right? Because they wouldn't integrate. In North Carolina, I went to school at North Carolina A&T in Greensboro because I couldn't get in Duke or Wake Forest. They were just beginning to take kids about the time this little black boy was integrated into society. And Wallace, I mentioned that I went to North Carolina A&T State University in Greensboro. One of the young men who came in just now also went there. If you Google it on the web, one of the things you'll find about it, part of its claim to fame, that's where the civil rights sit-ins started. And he was part of them, as was I. And so you go to jail, right? You go to jail for trying to buy a bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich. Do you believe that? Oh, man, come on, right? You go to jail because you're trying to go to the movie theater to get a ticket to see Gone with the Wind, right? The guy said, we can't, sir. Oh, man, you got to go to jail. In America? Oh, man. But yeah, we did that kind of stuff. While we were demonstrating in Greensboro, one of the things people don't appreciate is that we had to break down the doors to everything. So even McDonald's. Can you imagine going to jail for the right to buy French fries and chicken nuggets at the McDonald's in Greensboro? Can you imagine that in this country? But that's the kind of stuff we did. That's just the kind of stuff we did. And so I was indicating, just like with that church, all that stuff we went through, this little boy went through all those same kinds of things. One of his last indignities before things began to change happened right here in Northern Virginia. This little boy, he studied he studied mathematics in college, received a commission in the United States Army, left A&T, went to Penn State, left Penn State, went to work on Wall Street, and got called to active duty in the United States Army. His first Army assignment was here in Northern Virginia. The Army Corps of Engineers School used to be at Fort Belvoir. And so he came here as a young cadet to study engineering at the Army school here at Fort Belvoir. And so he's military, some of you guys are not, but when you go to a new military base, you come in, sir, President accounted for, you check in, and then you go find somewhere to stay, right? Okay. So I'm on Route 1 going from the Beltway south up and down Route 1 looking for places to stay. And between the Beltway and Route 1, there are 113 motels and 126 apartment complexes, and nobody would rent me a room. This is 1968. Nobody would rent me a room. Moreover, they weren't coy about it. Coy, C-O-Y. In the African American community, there's a phenomenon where you call a rental place or something to get an apartment, and they say, yeah, sure, come over. And you get over and they say, oh my God, I didn't know you were black. And so they conveniently come up with an excuse. We just rented them, sorry, right? But the people on Route 1, as I was coming here as a cadet, they weren't coy. They say, we don't rent to Negroes. Are you kidding me? I'm a commissioned officer in the United States. I have a graduate degree out of Penn State. I was making more money on Wall Street than you made in a year, in a month than you made in a year. And the only reason I'm here is to train to fight your nation wars on your behalf. And you tell me I don't qualify for an $89 room at the Best Western? Are you crazy? But that was the experience I had. That was my introduction to Northern Virginia in 1968. And shortly thereafter, things changed, and this little boy went on, like that church did, to success. Next slide. But this is why I worry. This is why I worry. The lady in the middle is my lovely daughter. We had dinner last night. She's a physician. She has a practice in Bowie. She grew up in what I would call the sweet spot of our nation's racial history. She was brought up in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And so she knew none of this nonsense. As a kid, her mom had her in a Montessori school that was like the United Nations. They'd have a little sleepover at the house, be 12 little girls, and there'd be no two from the same nation: Pakistan, India, Korea, Colombia, Canada. And that's all she knew, the little lady in the middle. She went on up through school. She went to med school. At med school, friends. In fact, at med school, not only was she not constrained by being black, not even by being a woman, her roommates in med school was a guy. A guy from San Francisco, Japanese background, right? So I mean, she was just herself, and that's what she knew. And the attitudes at that time was what led to us being accommodating or accepting of President Obama, right? Then things flipped. And the reason I worry are those two little boys. Suddenly those two little boys faced the possibility of going through the same nonsense that I had to go through 50 years ago. And that's what breaks my heart. This little boy, he's 6 now, he's in first grade. And he just plays with his playmates, and they have the greatest time ever. About 2 years from now, he's gonna be on the playground, and one of his playmates is gonna call him a bad name. Is going to call him out of his name, and all the kids are going to laugh and snicker, and he's going to cry, and he's going to come home. Because of his innocence, he says, Mommy, why did they call me that, and why did they laugh? And he won't even know. And the little boy who calls him will have gotten it from his daddy, right? And so this little boy here, this cute little boy, isn't he dressed nice? This cute little boy is going to be subjected to the same nonsense I was 50 years ago because of this racial animus that has been released. And you see his little brother on the left. Oh, I love this little guy. You see him? A couple of years ago, when we have our Christmas pageant, he was baby Jesus in the Christmas pageant. As an infant, he was baby Jesus, right? Okay, and he remembers the adulation you get by playing Jesus in a play, right? Okay, and so a year and a half from now, 2 years from now, his little preschool is going to be planning the Easter pageant, and they're going to, when they're casting, he's going to run to his teacher and say, Miss Jones, can I be Jesus? Can I be Jesus? And she's going to say, no, Ellis, you can't be Jesus. Jesus is white, right? Everybody knows that, right? Everybody knows Jesus is white. So if you're casting for a play for Jesus to play, at Easter, you want a white boy, right? Right. But he is going to be crushed by that. Why? Because one, he's played Jesus, so he knows the role. But more importantly, if you read the book of Revelation, it says what? Jesus has hair like wool, right? So here's this little boy that has the woolly hair and has played the role before, being told you can't be Jesus because Jesus is white, right? It's going to break his little heart. Those are the kind of indignities these little boys are going to experience, and that's what breaks my heart. The two illustrations illustrate the kind of indignities they're going to be encountered. One are the deliberate. There are some people out there with malice aforethought who are going to say things and do things to them to break their heart. Similarly, there are going to be people who will do things not out of malice, but just out of ignorance or indifference to their culture, right? There are certain things we know. We know for Halloween, you don't dress up as a stormtrooper, a Russian trooper, right? I mean, a Nazi, right? We know that, right? But we don't know things like you don't put on grease paint, okay? That can be equally insulting to an African American. And those are the kinds of things these little boys are going to experience. And my prayer, and she mentioned it in her opening prayer, is that the country goes back to living up to its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all of us are created equal. God bless you.
Does anybody have a Julie?
So, thank you so much for your talk. I love the way you showed humor in your story. And you mentioned at the end, this is why your heart breaks. What can we do so your heart doesn't break?
Oh, God, yeah. It's a beautiful question. We have a fair number of white members in our congregation, and they come to me with that same thing. It is such a huge problem. It is such a huge problem. Spreading love yourself. I'll put it this way. Wherever you see it, call it out. That would be my thing, right? Wherever you see it, call it out. There's some problems that are so big, you can't put on a national campaign. But if when you see somebody insulting this sweet little boy, call him and say, no, you can't do that. Call him out. That would be my recommendation in terms of what you as an individual can do. When you see an injustice, call it out. It is so easy to walk away and say, that was so nasty. And just say, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. Thank you.
One more.
Amen.
Amen. Tim.
So how are you fortunate enough to be able to meet this lady that you talked about?
This lady? Okay, this beautiful lady. She and I were in college together. We were both engineering and mathematics majors, so we met in college. Today, there are lots of women in engineering, but when she came through in the 60s, there were maybe 6 or 7 women total in the engineering school. So think about this. If you're an engineer and there's a beautiful woman who is smart, is that a no-brainer or what? Is that a no-brainer or what? So we've been married, 48 years. So after I came here as a second lieutenant, I was here at Fort Belvoir, and we got married while I was stationed at Fort Belvoir, and we've been married ever since. Stand up, baby.
Okay, we'll do one more.
Okay.
Carol Donlin.
Well, I've got to ask you about this, and this is the elephant in the room. We have a plaque over there to Robert E. Lee. We have another one to George Washington, and we are moving. Have you heard about all that?
Yes. I'll tell you.
So we really appreciate your being here. Could you just talk to that for just a moment?
One thing, the way I first met her was in 2011. You guys had a reconciliation service here, and I attended the service, and she addressed those plaques. We were kidding about it this morning. She addressed those plaques in 2011. The removal of symbols like that, I am all for it. Most of us know what happened with the Civil War. The Civil War was about slavery, and it was a horrible thing. The South went home after the war and cried in their beer for 30 years and said, we're tired of crying, and they flipped it. And if I were a professor of marketing at Harvard, that's what I would tell you. That was the best example of repackaging and repositioning a position. That was ingenious. And so that's when you came out with the lost cause narrative that said slavery was good. Oh, by the way, all our guys who fought were brave, and let's put up all these monuments. And so, yeah, you got yours about the same, shortly about the same time the statue was.
1870.
Yeah, the one's put here in Miller Street, and all over the South. And it is just so great now to see those symbols removed, because this is the phrase I use too. People say you can't remove these things because you're rewriting our history. No, 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 no. What we are doing is rewriting the rewrite. They rewrote history in the 1870s and 80s to take what had been horrible and glorify it. And that has been the position out in the community writ large. So what is happening now is we are rewriting the rewrite. And so every effort to do that, I support it. I testified when we were, before the city, when we were trying to get rid of the Confederate statue, made some of those same points. And so every effort to remove these symbols that are in themselves not historic, but are the rewrite of history, I strongly support.
And on that note, we have to go to church. Thank you.
Amen.